Okay, everybody, we're back. It's time to do chapter 2, which is Heraclitus. So just jumping right in here, we're going to be doing a stream of videos, and some are going to be shorter, some are going to be longer. It depends on the chapter that we go through and what we read and kind of how much meat there is. Here at the beginning of this book, these are probably going to be shorter videos, and then as we really get into the meat of it and there's more to discuss, we're probably going to be looking at some longer content. So go ahead and just bear with us, and we'll put them all in a playlist in order so that you can follow those yourself at your leisure. Thank you for watching, by the way. So here in chapter 2, we're going to start off with this thought that it's not until Heraclitus we find in Greece theories which could be compared in their historicist character with the doctrine of the chosen people. And that's this religious idea that originates in Judaism, but it doesn't only pop up there. So there's sort of this idea that there's this chosen people, and Popper thinks that's the most historicist thing ever. What he says here is what Homer tries to stress and to explain is not the unity of history, but rather its lack of unity. And so when we look at sort of the evolution of philosophical thinking in ancient Greece, and we know that Homer is a major part of that because we've been reading our Plato and our Aristotle, and we've seen sort of some of the throwbacks that they make to Homer. What you see is that there's sort of this dissolution of what we're looking at in terms of historicism at the very beginning, and so it's precisely during a time in which historicism has declined that Plato is becoming popular, and that's significant, as we'll see here. And Heraclitus is somebody who has a similar background to Plato. He's also an aristocrat, so he's someone who Popper also basically accuses of being like an authoritarian, and his reasoning is to some extent at least it's based on fact, although I could certainly see it being possible for a guy like Heraclitus to be kind of upset with the way things are going on the basis of what's been going on in his family, and with respect to their social position. So Plato's uncles were part of the 30 tyrants, and that's an issue because it sort of links Plato to this authoritarian ideology, which for whatever reason is going to just kind of brainwash him into also being an authoritarian for Popper. Though I don't know, again, that we have a perfect reason to sort of buy into that. So here, the first highlighted quote we've got is, "His interpretation of the people's motives is most interesting, for it shows that the stock in trade of anti-democratic argument has not changed much since the early days of democracy. They said, nobody shall be the best among us, and if somebody is outstanding, then let him be so elsewhere, and among others." And so there's like sort of this Ayn Randian vibe in Heraclitus that Plato that Popper here is going to pick up on and kind of follow into Plato, and again I think it's very important for us to read and understand what's going on with this critique, because I think this is one of the main places that we can see this critique, and I think the fact that it's coming from someone who is a person we would think of as more or less an avowed centrist in terms of political views, that means that we can't really assume, as a lot of people on the right like to do with respect to Popper and George Soros and these other philosophers, that there is like sort of a I don't know, like a political bent to it, right? I think this is as close to an apolitical, unbiased read of this stuff as possible, but it's kind of telling that we can pick up on a little bit of bias there anyway, which is certainly just Popper's own perspective and his own argument that these people were arguing for authoritarianism. And why were they arguing for authoritarianism? Well, they're trying to say that the masses are not capable of being adequate stewards of a democracy. I think if you look back on ancient Greece and look through the history, you could make a fairly compelling argument for that. I think that the decline of the Athenian democracy is a real tragedy, but it definitely was an event that took place. So perhaps these critiques have some amount of merit. I don't want to say that they need to be taken to the extreme that Popper wants to take them to, however. So let's just kind of continue moving on here. He says, but in the Heraclitean philosophy, one of the less commendable characteristics of historicism manifests itself, namely an overemphasis on change, combined with the complementary belief in an inexorable and immutable law of destiny. It often seems as if they were trying to comfort themselves for the loss of a stable world by clinging to the view that change is ruled by an unchanging law. And I think that's extremely insightful. So what Popper's saying here is basically that, look, Heraclitus has been through a lot in his life, and he's making these arguments about you can't step in the same river twice and so on, but because he really does have a sense of just the ephemerality of being. And so there isn't really, in some sense, maybe as much support for it as maybe Heraclitus might see. And I think that's where the critique that Popper's putting together here wants to go. But at the same time, we got to do sort of we got to make the postmodern move, and we got to understand the circumstances of the writer so that we can understand the writing. And that's what Popper's doing here. So this is very, very good stuff. He says this failure to distinguish between legal laws or norms on the one hand and natural laws or regularity on the other is characteristic of tribal tabooism. Both kinds of law are treated as magical, which makes a rational criticism of the man-made taboos as inconceivable as an attempt to improve upon the ultimate wisdom and reason of the laws or regularities of the natural world. All events proceed with the necessity of fate. The sun will not outstep the measure of his path, or else the goddess of fate, the handmaids of justice, will know how to find him. But the sun does not only obey the law. The fire, in the shape of the sun, and as we shall see of Zeus's thunderbolt, watches over the law and gives judgment according to it. The sun is the keeper and guardian of the periods, limiting and judging and heralding and manifesting the changes and seasons which bring forth all things. This cosmic order, which is the same for all things, has not been created, neither by gods nor by men. It always was, and is, and will be, an ever-living fire, flaring up according to measure, and dying down according to measure. In its advance, the fire will seize, judge, and execute everything. That's pretty intense. He says, combined with the historicist ideas of a relentless destiny, we frequently find an element of mysticism. And when he says mysticism, the philosophical definition of mysticism is a position with regard to metaphysics that can't be proven or shown. So it's a proposition that can't be known, for example. And we see a lot of mysticism in theology. There are a lot of people who say, yes, I can't prove that God exists, but I have faith, and so on and so forth. And that's really that's a good example of what mystic thinking is. So when we think about this element of mysticism that's kind of inherent, you might say, in this historicism that Popper is accusing Heraclitus of sort of having indulged in, what we're looking at is a situation in which Heraclitus is pointing to something that can't be rationally proven or shown, and just saying that's the way the world is. And that's going to be really the Achilles heel of the Heraclitean argument here. So let's move right along. He says, Heraclitus' dynamics of nature in general, and especially of social life, confirms the view that his philosophy was inspired by the social and political disturbances he had experienced. For he declares that strife or war is the dynamic as well as the creative principle of all change, and especially of all differences between men, and being a typical historicist, he accepts the judgment of history as a moral one, for he holds that the outcome of war is always just. War is the father and king of all things. It proves some to be gods and others to be mere men, turning these into slaves and the former into masters. One must know that war is universal and that justice, the lawsuit, is strife, and that all things develop through strife and by necessity. But if justice is strife or war, if the goddesses of fate are at the same time the handmaids of justice, if history, or more precisely, if success, i.e. success in war, is the criterion of merit, then the standard of merit must itself be in flux. Heraclitus meets this problem by his relativism and by his doctrine of the identity of opposites. This springs from his theory of change, which remains the basis of Plato's and even more of Aristotle's theory. A changing thing must give up some property and acquire the opposite property. And so that's the way in which we're able to differentiate between things, right? We can say something has changed if we can differentiate between its two states, and the minimum philosophical criterion for differentiation is actually just any ability to tell things apart. And I realize that's actually a circular definition. So coming back to what it says here on the page, a changing thing must give up some property and acquire the opposite property. And what it means by that, like let's say we've got a stack of sheets of paper. They're all identical. It's a ream. There's 250 sheets. So for one of those pieces of paper to give up its status as the 137th sheet of paper in that ream, it would have to become not the 137th sheet of paper in that ream. So if you flipped it over and we're counting from the opposite side, and now it was the 113th or whatever number piece of paper, then the property that it had at the beginning of that operation is now the opposite. It's a property that it doesn't have anymore. And so that's the way in which a changing thing must give up some property and acquire the opposite property. And really, I mean, the Hericlitean philosophy, as well as the Platonic and Aristotelian philosophies, are rich grounds for exploration. I want to make clear that just because we're reading this book, which is critical of Plato, that doesn't give anybody the right to write Plato off and just ignore Platonic philosophy, right? Because the thing is, at the end of the day, a lot of these people have something very real to teach us, and we're not going to learn unless we get out there and actually have a look at their work. So we're not going to necessarily do tons of Plato right now for underground philosophy, although there is certainly the option to bring in some dialogues and read them in this forum as well, which I think is probably a good thing to do. So let's go ahead and finish up this chapter right quick. Popper says, but the relativism of values, it might even be described as an ethical relativism, expressed in the last fragment, does not prevent Heraclitus from developing upon the background of his theory of justice of war and the verdict of history, a tribalist and romantic ethic of fame, fate, and the superiority of the great man, all strangely similar to some very modern ideas. Who falls fighting will be glorified by gods and by men. The greater the fall, the more glorious the fate. The best seek one thing above all others, eternal fame. One man is worth more than 10,000 if he is great. It seems as if historicist ideas easily become prominent in times of great social change. I wonder why that might be, and I wonder what the relevance of that claim is to our current political moment. Admittedly, the change is different. The change at this point in time is just a massive adoption of new technology that's making the world more interconnected than it's ever been before. The change back in ancient Greece, I believe, might be termed accurately the rise of democracy. So that, democratic governance may be itself the technological change that these people were dealing with. But Popper does want to, basically just say, look, great social change creates great social upheaval. And during this upheaval, people grasp for simplistic, historicistic ideas, basically to try to comfort themselves. He says they appeared when Greek tribal life broke up, as well as when that of the Jews was shattered by the impact of the Babylonian conquest. There can be little doubt, I believe, that Heraclitus' philosophy is an expression of a feeling of drift, a feeling which seems to be a typical reaction to the dissolution of the ancient tribal forms of social life. In modern Europe, historicist ideas were revived during the Industrial Revolution, and especially through the impact of political revolutions in America and France. It appears to be more than a mere coincidence that Hegel, who adopted so much of Heraclitus' thought and passed it on to all modern historicist movements, was a mouthpiece of the reaction against the French Revolution. And that's fascinating, because Hegel's thought is Hegel's another major philosopher who was active around the beginning of the 19th century, I guess. The early 1800s. Hegel was writing and giving these lectures to like this packed lecture hall. And sort of the critique of Popper for Hegel is that Hegel's philosophy was designed to be unintelligible. And so you're supposed to be like some super genius if you could figure out what he was talking about. And so there's sort of an inherent elitism that's just there from the very beginning with Hegel. And in addition to that, there's some totalitarianism that's going to tend to creep in. I think you could relatively compellingly make an argument that the rise of the Third Reich was predicated to some extent upon Hegelian philosophy that had become mainstream. And so I think that's a very, very interesting line. And I would say, just right off, no questions in my mind, Popper did a better job of critiquing Hegel than he did of critiquing Plato. But okay, don't forget to subscribe and make a comment on the video if you have something to say about it. We're about to end this recording for chapter 2, and chapter 3 is coming up next. Thank you so much.